Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 795, March the 2nd, 1987. The two big stories of the week, or the two that got the most attention, were the forced resignation of Chief of Staff Donald Reagan and the Senator Tower report on the National Security Council. For the past few weeks, I've been going into the narcotics connections, gun running and narcotics connections, of people involved in Contragate and their links up to the White House, the Chief of Staff, the former Chief of Staff, and the Vice President of the United States, and I will be doing a lot of the drug connections for weeks to come. I just will do a little bit this evening on Donald Reagan. He's not through yet. He may be out of the White House, but I'm sure there will be repercussions of having forced him out of the White House. On March the 2nd, 1986, the Chief of Staff, Donald Reagan's firm, Merrill Lynch, the one that he managed for many, many years, was chairman of, was blackballed from the management committee of the London Stock Exchange. Members voted against various persons, including Merrill Lynch, in its rules committee, citing, in quotes, a long history of disreputable practices at Merrill Lynch. Donald Reagan headed it for 12 years. In 1981, when Ronald Reagan was running for president, up to the point where he was inaugurated, he was working for donating money to Carter Mondale heavily to become Secretary of the Treasury if they won, and of course he was firmly behind Ronald Reagan and became Secretary of the Treasury. He would have had the job under either administration. He's that important. While he was at Merrill Lynch, Donald Reagan turned that firm into what was described by the Crime Commission reports and in various lawsuits and investigations. It became a drug money laundry place for large investments of mafia, organized crime, putting the money into Merrill Lynch. At the U.S. Treasury, he worked very hard in those 4 years to make it possible for the entire U.S. banking system to become dependent on the amount of money, the liquidity that they got from illegal narcotics revenues, by setting up offshores banking that could be used for narcotics, and also a banking system where the bulk of the money can be taken out of American banks. Then the deposits and cash they need come from the drug connections, or the banks collapse. The President's Commission, and I'm talking about President Ronald Reagan's Commission on Organized Crime, with Executive Director Charles Harmon, said that, in quotes, bankers shouldn't help narcotic traffickers, and bankers have to choose to prevent the trafficking. On June the 13th, 1985, Attorney General Edwin Meese wrote to Vice President George Bush, and of course all of this is comical, because starting in 1985, Donald Reagan moved from the Treasury to become Chief of Staff of the White House. And Meese wrote, in quotes, criminals and drug trafficking rings couldn't operate so successfully without the means to launder money, making criminal activity appear legitimate and available for investments. In 1978, while Donald Reagan was chairman of Merrill Lynch, he entered into a series of business ventures in New York that were based with the Boston Bank, the White Weld Securities Company. They merged Merrill Lynch and the White Weld to the Credit Suisse that the Boston Bank was head of in Zurich, Switzerland. And that group, Merrill Lynch, Suisse, and Weld, it became a triangle there, dominate the $49 million yearly euro-dollar market overseas, and control this huge amount of money that is overseas through the White Weld Securities, Credit Suisse, and Merrill Lynch. And this became a haven for drug money. Credit Suisse received more than $1.2 billion in unreported cash transactions in 1982-83 in violation of law from their main branch, the Bank of Boston. In 1984, President Reagan's Commission on Organized Crime, headed by Judge Kaufman, had a report titled The Cash Connection, Organized Crime, Financial Institutions, and Money Laundering. They reported, in quotes, Merrill Lynch was key to Pizza Connections, a Sicilian mafia network inaugurated in 1981, stretching from Palermo to Milan to New York, New Jersey area, operating through pizza parlors which flooded the east coast of the U.S. with high-grade Golden Crescent heroin from Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan province on the northwest frontier. Now, Ollie North and General Singh Laub and General Secord and Adnan Khashoggi and Albert Hakim and Edwin Wilson and Thomas Kleins, the very people involved in the Contragate story were very much a part of narcotics traffic in Southeast Asia, trying to take back Cuba for Marlansky and the Mafia, and that was what the invasion of Bay of Pigs was for, bringing in narcotics from the Vietnam War, and the big story of our dealing with Khomeini, dealing with Iran, the Mossad at the very highest level, as I've said before, has more to do with narcotics than it has with the geopolitical strategy of bordering on the Soviet Union. A report came out, as I say, the Kaufman report came out, and then it stated that Treasury Secretary Donald Reagan, he was in the Treasury for 4 years, had sabotaged money laundering law enforcement. He protected known offshore havens for dope money, and he protected dirty business dominated by what was his old firm Merrill Lynch and their current partner Credit Suisse. Donald Reagan's Merrill Lynch laundered his own company, when he was the head of it, $4.9 million in small bills for Sicilian mafiosa Franco Della Torre, starting in March 1982. Merrill Lynch officially was run by other persons as Don Reagan went to Secretary of the Treasury, but all of this was going on in his company, and he's not separate from it. And Larry Speaks, the White House press secretary, who resigned just this past month, is now getting $250,000 for the newscaster or the news reports that come out of Merrill Lynch. This report said, according to the President's Commission on Organized Crime, the Cash Connection, Merrill Lynch provided special services to help Della Torre launder the proceeds of heroin sales. In making large cash deposits at Merrill Lynch, Della Torre's practice was to request that security personnel accompany him from his hotel to Merrill Lynch offices. After several such deposits, arrangements were made to escort the money from Della Torre's hotel directly to the Bankers Trust, where Merrill Lynch maintained accounts. Now, Judge Kaufman, I've mentioned him before, was the judge that prosecuted the Rosenbergs. He's hardly a liberal, and he's writing about a firm that was doing these transactions and now has their chairman as the Secretary of our Treasury. The Kaufman report goes on. Della Torre had an account in a corporate named Traex, Traex, with Merrill Lynch for 1 year. A bagman for the Pizza Connection ring, Della Torre laundered an estimated $20 million through Merrill Lynch and other brokerage houses into sheltered accounts at Credit Suisse in Zurich, Switzerland. Della Torre, according to the Commission report, brought his gym bags and cardboard cartons full of small denomination bills to a suite in New York's Waldorf Astoria Towers, where top executives of Merrill Lynch would regularly make pickups of the cash for deposit at Merrill Lynch accounts at the Bankers Trust. The Merrill Lynch officers even arranged security guards to accompany Della Torre to the hotel. During the entire period, Della Torre's deposits were under observation by the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration, and to this day no action has been taken against Merrill Lynch. Italian magistrates are now prosecuting 440 top mafiosi in Italy in relation to the Pizza Connection. Their operation ties into more than 100 murders, including those of law enforcement officials such as Carabinieri, National Police, General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa, and I mentioned him before several years ago when he was murdered, the chief investigator of the links between organized crime, drugs, Red Brigades, terrorists in Italy. Now, the person that was investigating the Pizza Connections and the Red Brigades and drugs at the same time was going into the area of the Super Sesame, the Italian intelligence with Henry Kissinger, Michael Ledeen, and Alexander Haig, who tied directly into the Pizza Connections that were depositing their money into Donald Reagan's Merrill Lynch. Lots of money that has been named by the president, who appoints Donald Reagan as his Treasury Secretary and then his chief of the White House staff. While all these investigations are going on, he has a cabinet administration position with the President of the United States. The report said the Pizza Connection also cuts directly into Bulgarian Drug and Assassins Bureau through Masululi Yasar Avni, the Turkish mafia boss, who operates out of Sofia, Bulgaria. Masuli's heroin shipping and gun-running operation in Zurich, Switzerland were funded out of Swiss accounts into the Merrill Lynch funneled money. And this connects again into Ali Mehmet Agca, his relationship to Theodore Shackley, who is heavily involved in the Contragate story and a defendant in the Christic Institute suit of drug running, assassinations, and attempted coups, all the crimes that go with terrorism or freedom fighters of Ronald Reagan. The Italian sources are convinced that the recent death in the prison of Vatican banker Michele Sindona, who bit the cyanide bullet, was the latest assassination ordered to protect the pizza connection. Credit Suisse is the world's dirtiest bank, according to this report, and also mentioned in the Congressional Record, June 27, 1985, testimony of Senator Jesse Helms, no flaming liberal. He linked the June 14th, interestingly enough, June 14th, 1985 hijacking Flight 847 by the Lebanese Shiites to 100 million Lebanese pounds found delivered by the Shiites by the Iranians' Martyrs Foundation. Helms had the following report on the source of the funds. It is unclear whether these funds were delivered as actual money or delivered in the form of banking instrument which could be drawn against the Martyrs Foundation, held, for example, by Marine Midland Bank in London and Credit Suisse in Switzerland. And the links of narcotics, TWA flight, and banks goes again to persons in the National Security Council and the Chief of Staff of the White House. In September 1978, Merrill Lynch chairman Donald Reagan, this is 3 years before he was Secretary of the Treasury, arranged Merrill Lynch's takeover of White Weld Securities. This put Merrill Lynch in effective business partnership with Credit Suisse, the money laundering business that has been going on effectively controlled through its joint venture with White Weld in Boston. Credit Suisse White Weld, which provided White Weld with 75% of its annual earnings, Credit Suisse is accused of laundering the bulk of $1.67 billion in heroin traffic at issue in the Pizza Connection case. Merrill Lynch is accused of having laundered $3.9 million of this money. And Credit Suisse in Geneva is the bank. It has 3 branches in Switzerland. It is the bank identified, or one of the banks, involved with Permindex and the assassination of John Kennedy and other political figures around the world. Through various documents, Credit Suisse is one of those banks. Now, I'll do more on Donald Reagan and the banking connections later, but I think you get a view of why it was so hard to fire him from the White House and why he sat there and literally kept the President of the United States a prisoner inside the White House, and it was very hard to extricate him out. Now, this past week, February the 27th, there's an article in the New York Times, and it was in all the wire services. Warrants for Vatican bankers raise legal problems. The country of Italy has asked the individual entity called the Vatican to turn over 3 persons involved in the collapse of the Banco Ambrosiano. The chief one that they want is Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the head of the Vatican Bank, and 2 other persons. And these people are wanted for the collapse of that bank, for other banks, for writing money with credit from the Vatican to Banco Ambrosiano. And, of course, the lawsuit says that Archbishop Marcinkus, as well as Mr. Manini and Mr. Distrobel in the Vatican, effectively authorized Banco Ambrosiano to give loans of over $1.3 billion into 10 Panama dummy companies with few or no assets. The funds were later used as collateral to secure existing debts or get fresh loans. Large amounts of the loans have not been accounted for, though the Milan investigators suspect at least some of the money went to the Italian Masonic Lodge called Propaganda 2. And again, Michael Ledeen of Contragate and Henry Kissinger are members of the P2 Lodge out of Monte Carlo. The Panama banks are tied up now into approximately 12 or 14 banks that the investigators want to go into in the Contragate story. The Panama banks, the Swiss banks, are very important, but at this time, the Archbishop Marcinkus is wanted, and they mentioned in this article that when the Banco Ambrosiano collapsed 6 weeks later, Chairman Roberto Calvi, a close associate of Archbishop Marcinkus, was found hanged at a London bridge. So Michele Sindona, another one of God's bankers, along with Roberto Calvi, the president of Banco Ambrosiano, are mentioned in murders because they're witnesses to these events. Now the people who want to know where this $1.3 billion went and who are the 10 Panamanian dummy fronts, they actually were doorknobs with numbers on them. Where did this go? And the P2 money, of course, is to begin, making the whole world Christian, to have military coups, to put in fascist dictators. It was a secret society that surfaced with many people related to Henry Kissinger, Alexander Haig, Ronald Reagan, and the team in the White House that worked very closely with Nazis, narcotics traffic, assassinations, and coups. I made a chart this week of 13 major lawsuits pending in terms of Contragate involving missing money, one with missing 10 million, another missing 10 million, another 30 million, the Bank Ambrosiano, that 1.4 billion, and trials and investigations of missing money or Contragate suits. And in a way, they all link to each other. It's a very complicated network, but there's no way that even someone like John Tower, hand-selected by the president, is able to carry on and cover up as much as he would want to cover up, because the door is open now and the toothpaste is not going back in the tube. And as Ronald Reagan's son sets, the sun is going down on his administration, and for all purposes it's over. Newsweek has a cover of the president cover-up. To protect the president, staffers say Don Reagan ordered to conceal the approval of arms sales, and so forth. It has a black and white picture of Ronald Reagan, very dismal, and many articles accompany this throughout the world press and on television. 1/3 of the people, according to polls, and I don't like polls, say that he should resign. But on the cover of Newsweek, under the black cover and black and white picture of Ronald Reagan in disarray, is a yellow box with an article authored by Henry Kissinger, Gorbachev's Challenge by Henry Kissinger. And above all the chaos, all the people that are fired, all the people that are killed, all the lives that are ruined, up at the top remain Fritz Kramer, Fred Ickley, Daniel Graham, Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Alexander Haig. And Henry Kissinger, always like in Watergate, with Alexander Haig setting up Agnew and Nixon for the fall, they remain the elder statesmen. The same Newsweek then has a picture of Kissinger smiling, shaking hands with Mr. Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, titled Kissinger, How to Deal with Gorbachev. And he becomes the traveling statesman, just as he was at the time of Watergate, when he gets the Nobel Peace Prize and goes to the Soviet Union, and Nixon and Agnew are removed from office, and there's chaos for a short while, but these men always have control. When Reagan made a blunder at Reykjavik, he was forced to go there because of the Danilov arrest, and I've done many broadcasts on that. Out of that whole bag of chaos comes Alexander Haig, and of course, in the Washington Times, Reverend Moon's paper, he has a long article, or an article about him. Haig second guesses Reagan on Reykjavik and the near mishap, and it tells how Haig's addressing the Heritage Foundation, how they have to save the Reykjavik and what went on there. And another article, Reagan was ill-prepared for Reykjavik, and New York Times has an editorial, Exercise Reykjavik, forget it never happened, let's go back to the bargaining tables. Reagan is expendable, pretend he didn't go there, he made a blunder, the statesmen survive above him, he is like the garbage people, expendable, and this chaos continues as various people lose jobs and get immunity and so forth, but the power structure remains the same and is very visible in articles on television and holding a tight line. There's a lot of publicity around Fawn Hall, the secretary for Oliver North. She also was dating Arturo Cruz, and North was giving her boyfriend's father $7,000 a month. Money's supposed to go to the Contras to Mr. Calero, put money under the table to them. Wilma Hall, her mother, until McFarlane was fired and then goes on working for National Security Council. Anyway, Wilma Hall, her mother, at the time of the Contragate, was secretary to Robert McFarlane. She formerly was secretary to Henry Kissinger in the National Security Council in 1970s. Contragate is a continuation of Watergate. McFarlane goes, Kissinger stays. Jane Esther McLaughlin was secretary to Carl Spitz Chanell. Finally, she left the FBI and told about the things that Chanell was doing and the money that was supposed to go to the Contras going into political pockets, and I'll do a lot more on that later. She formerly worked for Donald Reagan out of Merrill Lynch and went to Chanell's office while he was instrumental in trying to get people into Congress who voted for Star Wars or voted for the Contras and defeat those people in the American political scene who didn't want Star Wars and didn't want to fund the Contras. General John Gavin, the former head of NATO, was quickly removed from this past week. I like to see these job changes taking place. He was in charge of U.S. Southern Command in Panama, 1984 to 1986, where all these dummy fronts and money and ships were arriving with weapons and connections to illegal operations in Central America that Congress didn't approve of. John Gavin has now become the head of NATO, and formerly in 1970s he was military assistant to Alexander Haig when Haig used NATO, the P2, the Masonic Lodge, and so forth for terrorism in Europe, for creating things like the Red Brigades. And we need somebody over there to wipe up the scene, the Shovel Brigade, so quickly. The man formerly down in Panama when the banking chaos was taking place is now in Europe with NATO, the head of NATO. And again, Kissinger has his secretaries in these various offices. He has Alexander Haig has agents related to him militarily who take the job that he had, and Haig and Kissinger, Kramer, Fred Eakley, and Daniel Graham, another one of that team, stay in the background very nicely without being visible at all. In 1983, when I wrote the story of Larry McDonald's being killed in the Korean airline, it actually came out in February 84. I wrote it just in the fall of 83. As soon as the plane went down, I did a map. Many of you have the article I wrote with a picture of the Larry McDonald pie. And there were sections of the importance of Larry McDonald, national, international, and why I believe the article was based upon information that I had studied, and why I believe that Ronald Reagan and Edwin Meese had the most in having Larry McDonald's demise at that particular time. And one section of the pie was titled Western Goals, and he was chairman of Western Goals. At that time, it was located in Alexandria, Virginia, and on the board was Roy Cohn and Dr. Eugene Wigner, who works with the atomic energy and is close to Daniel Graham in Star Wars, Admiral Thomas Moore, Dr. Edward Teller of Star Wars, and of course there's General John Singlaub, John Reese, General George Patton III, and Linda Guell, Guell. I had her name in that pie picture I made of the important elements of people behind Larry McDonald. Now, Linda Guell's name is in the news in many articles this past week. It has to do with the office of Mr. Chanell, Carl Spitz Chanell, the public relations office that works closely with Oliver North and Thomas Buchanan, the former press secretary. And the offices there are very closely linked to Linda Guell. Now, Chanell became the director of Western Goals after Larry McDonald was killed. Wall Street Journal has an article just this past week, February 27th. Reagan officials misled Congress, helped Contras get military aid during 2-year ban. And in this article in the Wall Street Journal, it says there's a diagram sketched by Colonel North on an April 1985 letter showing arrows linking to names of F. Andrew Messing. We've seen him on television and read about him. Director of the Conservative National Defense Council, Robert Owen, and that's an important name, a defendant in the Christic Institute suit for, again, gun running, assassination, attempted coups, and so forth, narcotics traffic. Robert Owen, a former State Department consultant linked to the Contras, and Lyndon Guell, Guell, director of Western Goals, an organization headed by Carl Spitz Chanell. So the importance of Western Goals has never really been understood by a lot of people. I wrote about it, but those researchers that have the articles didn't recognize the importance of it. But these offices of Chanell are indeed important. The money is used to overthrow the electoral process to make it possible that when we have another election, or as many as we have, the proper people will be elected, just as Adolf Hitler was elected in 1933. There were many articles this past week mentioning Linda and her relationship to Mr. Chanell's office, and he became, as I said, the president of Western Goals, and she works for him. She was formerly with Larry McDonald in Western Goals. Her name is mentioned in the New York Times, February the 27th. Albert Hakim his offices were robbed recently up in Los Gatos, and papers were taken linking charts he had are linking the transfer of weapons from used aircraft with a Korean airline to Iran. And then, of course, after the papers were returned, then the story was that all they took out of his office was the Korean Airlines and security for Korea, and they erased the delivery of arms to Iran. Now, the Korean airline, the KAL, is a very important story linked to all these various characters, and I've done outlines and charts, but I want to just bring it up today because Linda Jewell's name from Western Goals is in these articles in her work for Chanell and is being a conduit of money that was not supposed to be sent for military aid because the Congress voted it wasn't supposed to be. And of course, I said all along that Western Goals is an operation linked directly to the Los Angeles Police Department. The agents of the police department were recognized as taking papers out of the offices. They were put into computers of Western Goals, and the extensive coverage of Western Goals never made the major wire services, but they have direct pipelines to or all police departments to put information about law-abiding citizens or people they don't want to run for office. So the significance of Western Goals is in the news now, and those offices are important. And I think that in time, the exposure of Western Goals for what it is should be questioned into how many police departments it taps $100,000 computers, and are they still doing the same? Mr. J. Paul, the LAPD agent who took the papers to his wife's garage where the $100,000 computer was, Mary Love, was reinstated to the police department. He was never fired, and he was actually rewarded because he got all his back pay, and they decided there was nothing wrong with taking private police reports to his garage and sending them to this cast of characters in Virginia and in Washington, D.C., who later appear to be breaking many laws, not just a law, and goodness knows why they put into their computer information about law-abiding citizens, and yet they go about breaking the law. Seymour Hersh is going to write a book about Muammar Gaddafi and the plans to kill him by the Reagan administration. He's working on it now. And there have been reprints of part of the book. It's syndicated in almost every newspaper I've taken. The New York Times has a long section of that book, February 22nd, 1987, Target Gaddafi. And, I've told you before that Seymour Hersh thought it was impossible that these very people that he's writing about now, would target Larry McDonald going down in the ocean at the time he was to testify about his computers with the police department of Western Goals. But with his links with John Singlau and Edward Teller and Eugene Wigner working close with Reverend Moon, always recognized and honored by him, and George Patton III and the who's who of the military right, Larry McDonald was perfectly expendable at that time, and furthermore, he could trigger off reactions of the Soviet Union to airplanes entering in their space, and then knowing it would blow up, they can blame the Soviet Union for being the terrible black empire they were. A lot of things were accomplished, and I mentioned those in my article and on the air many times, and I think that the fact that Larry McDonald was killed, I believe he was killed by these people. I'm sorry Seymour Hersh didn't see that at the time. Now he sees how they went out and set to kill Muammar Gaddafi and didn't think anything of it, hoping they still can take the country called Libya. And if people behave in this way, they earmark a country and persons for murder, they can do it in one area and get just as much effect as they do in another. There was an article in the Washington Post, I'm not going to share the whole article now, by Bob Woodward and Dan Oberdorfer, and they're also writing a book on Contragate, telling about the United States' plans to attack Libya. It's a long article, but there's just 2 sentences I want to share with you about this article at this time. It says, from Reagan's first full day in office, January the 21st, 1981, he focused on Libya and Iran and made opinions of what he was going to do with those countries, how he was going to attack them, and even after the TWA hijacking, when the 847, and it was televised and investigated, even though it didn't link Gaddafi or Libya to the hijacking in any way. And Bob Woodward writes on this one, it's Hersh with the KAL and Gaddafi. He said, although there is no direct connection between Libya and the TWA hijacking, top officials of the NSC and CIA were determined to get tough on Libya. No matter if there were no connections, they were going to use that to get tough on Libya. But it says, in mid-July 1985, papers written by Robert Gates, who was then head of the Intelligence Analysis Agency and now nominee for CIA director, reported that U.S. and Egypt should operate against Libya because it would present an opportunity to redraw the map of North Africa. Now, how does a Robert Gates, not elected by anybody, wants to be the CIA director, have the capacity to say, we'll kill these people, we'll take that land? That is why Gaddafi was armed by Edwin Wilson and Frank Churchill, to make him the terrorist, so we could come back, take the land, and redo the map of North Africa. In their own words, they were to redraw the map of North Africa. These people make these plans years ahead, and then when Ronald Reagan is inaugurated, the very first day they meet, the plans proceed. The terrorism, the agents provocateurs, set it up so that we can come in, take these countries, own the Mediterranean, own Africa, shape it to our liking. That is what they are doing, and Gates, who wrote this memo on his goals, wants to be the CIA director, as I say. We'll take a 1-minute break, and then I want to get back to Senator John Tower. Not his report, but John Tower himself and his shenanigans in Washington and in Texas. This is Mae Brussell. This is the second half of World Watchers, in case you picked it up in the middle of the program. It is a 1-hour analysis of news. It's program number 795. Before I go to John Tower, I just want to mention that the controversies aren't over in the White House. The recent one is that the Chief of Staff is blaming the First Lady for the appointee. Before he left, Donald Reagan blamed her for hurrying in the appointment of John O. Kohler, who belonged to the Nazi youth group. The Washington Post has an article about the hasty appointment of the new White House communications director has stirred fresh controversy within the strife-ridden Reagan administration and the wide rift between First Lady Nancy Reagan and White House Chief of Staff Donald Reagan. It seems that she wanted John Kohler, who belonged to the Nazi youth group in Germany, to become the communications director. Sources quoted Don Reagan, when he was in there, as acknowledging that he had interviewed Kohler, but the Chief of Staff added that Kohler's experience in the youth group was not on his resume when he read that. He gave it to persons in the communications department, but when they presented it to the Reagans, it wasn't there. The controversy within the White House is not over this aspect of Kohler's past, but what other experts say are described as the rushed manner in which the appointment was handled. They said the appointment was pushed by Nancy Reagan and U.S. Information Agency Charles Z. Wick. The appointment was announced Thursday. It was done quickly without running the usual traps, said a senior White House official. Other sources said they did not know Kohler was being hired, although Mr. Fitzwater said yesterday the Chief of Staff interviewed him and in terms of the recommendation, and it was Personnel Chief Robert Tuttle who approved of him. Now, it's Robert Tuttle's father, Holmes Tuttle, who was one of the original kitchen cabinet people behind Ronald Reagan, and Reagan's California history was filled with Nazis, right-wingers, and fascists, and Mr. Tuttle pushed this through. Another article about this particular person who has been hired as the director of communications in the White House. He said he escaped Nazi Germany in 1945. The war was over in 1945. The Wall Street Journal had a story this week. Mr. Reagan's supporters and critics alike say that the White House seems to be prone to stumbles in the wake of the Iran-Contra scandal. The new communications director, John Kohler, who replaced fiery Patrick Buchanan, got off to a bad start over the weekend. He has already angered White House officials because when he chose to explain his boyhood membership in a Nazi youth group in Germany, he held a press conference just as the president was delivering his weekly Saturday radio address, and the White House was furious. When Reagan speaks, they're all supposed to listen, and he chose to have his press conference at the same time the president was speaking. That gives you a little inkling of what's going to go on there. Now, the Wall Street Journal had an editorial February 27th called The Tower Report, and the gist of it is that the commission concluded that the National Security Council as an institution is not irreparably damaged, that the National Security Council chief should not be subject to congressional confirmation, and that the NSC is a necessary instrument of presidential policy. Now, Brent Scowcroft, General Scowcroft, was National Security Advisor. He had the position as chief of the NSC, so he's investigating an agency he had, and he doesn't want it whittled away. John Tower wanted to be the director of NSC when Mr. Poindexter was appointed, but he has those ambitions anyway. He's not going to whittle away his powers, and he doesn't want you to investigate him if he's appointed as the director. Wall Street Journal said the core of this country's difficulty in foreign policy is that many members of the Washington community adopt the radical position that Congress not only has powers in debate and to fund foreign policy, but it's entitled to engage in policy execution. That is a prescription for paralysis. The Tower Commission suggests placing the congressional oversight of covert activities in just a single committee with a very restricted staff. The Tower Commission says there is serious management breakdown, and that the problem is the leftists who want to take over foreign policies and decisions. It is a direct result of successive congressional legislative strategies originating mainly within the political left. The strategies had two goals: to restrict the executive's ability to act and to effectively absolve members of direct responsibility for any failures. Now, the report on Reagan's intentions to invade Libya included sending 90,000 American troops. Our budget is way, way in the hole because of weapons that we spend that they tell us we need. We give them the money. We can't confirm who's the chief, and we can't interfere with what they do. They want all policy for making wars and then having Congress declare it after it's already started, or going like Vietnam without a declared war. Now, John Tower's name came up at the time of the Kennedy assassination. In fact, the very day of the assassination, it was in the newspapers, and his secretary said that it was there because there were allegations that John Tower helped Lee and Marina Oswald come back to the United States. Now, I'm going to cite references to some of this material in the Warren Commission hearings. This one's from Volume 28, page 367. It was a confidential letter from a government official dated March 31st, 1961, saying that Oswald wrote the State Department in February of 1961, and he said it was inconvenient to go to Moscow for his interview. He didn't want to leave the city of Minsk. I see no reason for any preliminary inquiry. You can send it in a questionnaire to me. This is March 1961, and they said it is believed that whatever risk is involved in sending his passport by mail under the above conditions, it would be more than offset the opportunity provided the United States to obtain information from Mr. Oswald concerning his activities in the Soviet Union. It is the best interest of the United States to have him home. We should do everything within our power to facilitate Oswald's return and entry into the United States. That was in March 1961. And right after that, in 61, John Tower gets a letter in Washington, D.C. from Lee Harvey Oswald in Minsk. Dear Mr. Tower, my name is Lee Harvey Oswald. This is from Volume 22, Exhibit 105A. I come from Fort Worth until October 1959. He said, I live in the Soviet Union. Now I'm ready to come home. I've applied for a Soviet visa to come home with my wife. I applied to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, and I'm ready to come back to the United States. My passport number, he gives the number, and I beseech you, Senator Tower, to raise the question by letting me come home with my wife. That's what he wrote to Senator Tower, a letter that Tower had. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald got a letter July 24th, right after that, 1961, from John McVicker, described in Who's Who in the CIA as John Anthony McVicker, who worked for the CIA Department of State in the Soviet Union. He was in the Navy till 1949, stationed in Moscow, of course. And from the American Embassy in Moscow, he writes, Dear Mr. Oswald, we have your letter of July 15, 61 in regards to return to the United States and your application for a Soviet exit visa. You will recall that further action on your petition for non-quota status for your wife is pending the receipt for you of a copy of your marriage certificate. In other words, just send us a picture of that and 3 official copies, and we're waiting for that. John McVicker from the embassy in the Soviet Union. January the 5th, 1962, 6 months later, Dear Sirs, this is written by Lee Harvey Oswald to the embassy in the Soviet Union. It doesn't have any of the spelling or errors in Oswald's diary that was contributed by Gerald Ford and the Warren Commission and Henry Luce to the world at large. The way that it read, Oswald is a total illiterate. This letter he sends to the embassy is as neatly typed and clean as Mr. McVicker's. He could have been a secretary, and nothing in the spelling is wrong. He said, "This is to inform you that my expiration date in living in the Soviet Union is up January the 4th, 1962. I've already informed the embassy. Exit visas for myself and my wife have already been granted by the Soviet Union, and I want to make arrangements to come to the embassy in Moscow and make future plans. Please look into this and notify us. Yours truly, Lee Harvey Oswald." Now, January the 5th, 1962, he was received at the embassy, and his letter came. Then he was received at the embassy, and on January the 13th, and they discussed the forms that he would fill out for his wife to come to the United States. Now, there were only 2 or 3 Russian wives in the United States. I have the figure and the names of the people, and the Warren Commission, of course, noted that he did get here very quickly, and Oswald wrote nice letters to the embassy, and they wrote back to him. They said, "The question you raise of a loan to defray the part of your travel expense to the United States can be discussed when you come to the embassy," and, of course, they sent him the money to come home from the United States. Mr. Frederick Dutton from the State Department wrote to, there's a letter from John Tower to Mr. Dutton, dated January 26. "Enclosed correspondence I received from Lee Oswald relating to apparent efforts on his behalf to return to the United States." Now, he was all ready to come home. He told the embassy, "Send me the money, and my wife is coming." They said, "Just send the marriage certificate." The Soviets said he could come. So then John Tower writes to Frederick Dutton of Congressional Relations, Assistant Secretary, Department of State. He says, Tower said, "I don't know Mr. Oswald or any of the facts concerning his reason for visiting the Soviet Union or any action this government can take. Quite obviously, his inquiry should have been addressed to the executive branch, the president of the executive branch. For this reason, I'm furthering it to you." Then there's a memorandum sent back or received by John Tower's secretary, and her name is Linda. Her name is Linda Lovelady, and she comes from Texas. Now, there was a Lovelady that was in the door of the Texas School Book Depository that was very controversial, a dead ringer double for Lee Harvey Oswald, but Lovelady has a memorandum from the U.S. Senate, and her name's at the bottom, and she said, it's noted, "I received a call from Mr. Stanfield in the State Department regarding Mr. Lee Harvey Oswald's returning from the USSR. On November 2nd, 1955, Mr. Oswald swore the following affidavits. I affirm my allegiance to the Soviet Socialist Republic. He requested that his American citizenship be revoked. He now wants to return with his Soviet wife who is pregnant. His mother lives in Vernon, Texas. She can't pay for his return. The State Department will probably finance this on a loan basis," which, in fact, he never paid back. They had all of his finances. He didn't pay it back. "Senators should not become involved in such a case. Therefore, the State Department will report to us the course that they want to follow regarding Lee Harvey Oswald." February the 9th, John Tower wrote to Frederick Dutton of the State Department, "We enclose for your information copies of correspondence of recent information from the embassy at Moscow regarding Lee Harvey Oswald. The correspondence sent to you by Mr. Oswald is being returned. Should you wish to be kept informed of further developments regarding Oswald, an officer familiar with the case may be reached. This is to Senator Tower. You can call code number 182, extension 5340, and discuss Mr. Oswald on those lines." Signed by Patrick Dutton of the State Department. That was a time when Mr. Dutton was working in the State Department, as well as a Joseph Norbury from the Soviet Embassy, with a Robert Owen in charge of political affairs, the Office of Soviet Union Affairs in Washington, D.C. Now, in the lawsuit that the Christic Institute has of defendants in the Contragate, there is a Robert Owen. He's young. I checked that out. He's citizen of the United States, lives in Virginia, president of IDEA Incorporated, liaison to the Contras for Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. He has a brother, I understand, who worked for General Singlaub in Southeast Asia, and of course it remains to be seen. And I want to check out whether or not they are the son of a Robert Owen who was working in the State Department to get Lee and Marina out of this country, and they were also in contact with Senator John Tower in Texas. On May 8, 1962, there was a letter from Joseph Norbury from the embassy to Robert Owen in Washington, D.C., and it's regarding Lee Harvey Oswald, and they said, we will have you note on May the 4th in the Oswald case, if the 243G waiver is not granted, and that was the catch-22 here, Marina had to have a piece of paper signed and confirmed, or she couldn't leave the Soviet Union. And Mr. Norberg from the embassy says, if the waiver is not granted soon on this one, I think we should send the Oswalds to Belgium anyway. Don't wait for the papers that she needs to get out. It's not that our hearts are bleeding for the Oswalds. His arrogance knows no bounds. His latest letter contained an imperious demand that the State Department stop trying to get travel funds from his relatives to the U.S. He apparently thinks the travel money questions is the reason we deferred stalling him, but of course they gave him the money to come home. He said, how dare you ask my family for the money? I'm going to ask you for it, and they gave him the money for airplanes, trains, and boats, and he took a boat to New Jersey. The International Rescue Committee met them. Agents of that committee, headed by Leo Cherne, met them in New Jersey, had interviewed them for 2 days, put them on a plane. They flew to Fort Worth. Now, they were in Fort Worth from June 1962 up until the assassination of John Kennedy, but on November 22nd, 1963, in volume 22 of the Warren Commission hearings, there's a letter written by John Tower from the office of Senator John Tower regarding correspondence with Lee Harvey Oswald. One, it says Oswald wrote to the office of Senator Tower in January 62 per attached, the letter from Russia they sent back. The second point, Oswald letter was sent to the State Department. State reply to Senator Tower shown in attached correspondence and the name and the phone call by the State Department. 3, the state advised that the senator should not become involved in the case, and at no time did the senator correspond himself with Lee Harvey Oswald. He gave it to another channel, and then it was expedited. But the day John Kennedy was murdered, you would think that Senator Tower wouldn't know who he is or sit in Washington and write this letter. I spoke to Jim Garrison, a judge in New Orleans, who's such an expert on this case, and he thought it was rather interesting that John Tower's secretary and he were sending off letters the very day that John Kennedy was murdered. Now, in Volume 22, Exhibit 1058, there's information about John Tower and Mrs. Lovelady, and it tells about on January 26th, Senator Tower's office received a handwritten letter from Lee Harvey Oswald, Miss Lovelady, whose job was and is to take care of matters of this nature, Miss Lovelady, to take care of letters from people such as Lee and Oswald wanting to come to this country. She routinely passed the letter on to Mr. Frederick Dutton, Assistant Secretary for Congressional Affairs. And then it goes on to say that the reason they were interviewing her now, this is an interview by W. David Slauson of the Warren Commission to J. Lee Rankin after the assassination. The memo was written up June 8th, 1964. But the article, the interview goes on to say that Miss Lovelady and Mr. Towery told me of the deposition of the letter from Oswald. The first thing that concerned us was the document dated November 22nd, 1963, entitled Regarding the Correspondence of Lee H. Oswald. It is a statement prepared for the press November 22nd, 63. The history of this is that as soon as Oswald's name was mentioned in connection with the assassination on radio and television, Ms. Lovelady, Senator Tower's secretary, remembered that the senator's office had something to do with his name in the past, and after immediate file search, a statement for the press, along with the lines shown in the document, was made. The second matter concerning the Warren Commission and the Secretary of State is for the purpose of clearing John Tower's name from the wild charges that was made in foreign and domestic press to the effect that he facilitated Oswald's obtaining a repatriation loan from the Department of State or otherwise helped him to return to the United States. And the Warren Commission investigator W. David Slauson says these charges have no basis whatsoever in fact. But the question is, why would the world press on November the 22nd have a statement that John Tower worked and helped facilitate the return to Texas? Where would they get that information at all if Senator Tower only had one letter and passed it on? But there was a lot of communications. There was a private phone to use and so forth about the office of the Senator John Tower and the State Department and Lee Harvey Oswald. More to do than if he just transferred in letter and said, I don't know who this is. Now, Marguerite Oswald went to the Red Cross to get information. Lee wrote to her and said, go to the Red Cross and get information about my coming home. He wanted money to come home. and he asked Moscow for it. Instead of their writing the check, she was referred to the International Rescue Committee. This was in 1962. Leo Cherne was active in the International Rescue Committee, a very anti-communist organization. In 1987, Leo Cherne has been appointed by Ronald Reagan to head the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. In 1973-74, when Reagan and Edwin Meese were cooking up the SLA as the CIA, Leo Cherne, in those days, had a very important role, not yet fully disclosed, in the formation of that practicing for terrorism, and Patty Hearst was thrown in the trunk of a car when she was kidnapped, and the memos coming out of Oliver North and the White House now are using kidnapping as a technique for terrorists, throwing them in the back of the car, the way it was practiced out here in California with Patty Hearst. In 1965, Oswald was writing to Senator John Tower. He wanted to come home. He was bringing his Russian wife. And John Tower, in 1987, is the man appointed by Ronald Reagan to investigate, if you can call it those words, the National Security Council, who's ignoring the foreign banks, ignoring former CIA Director George Bush, and John Tower's wife, I mentioned before on this broadcast, not only got a large salary as a sub-cabinet level, I suppose, on arts or whatever from Ronald Reagan, but John Tower's brother-in-law Samuel Cummings provided the arms and missiles to arm Gaddafi via our State Department and the CIA. And by arming Gaddafi, we created a madman with weapons. And then Mr. Gates and he was acting in the FBI with the CIA and Defense Department, could reshape all of Africa map and begin invading Libya on the excuse that Gaddafi is a terrorist. When we send him the arms, there's no link of him to a lot of events that took place, agent provocateur excuses such as the Berlin disco bombing, the TWA hijacking. November 22nd, 1963, John Tower is writing letters to the State Department the very day that John Kennedy was murdered. Secretary for John Tower, in this whole time period with these letters going on, was Linda Lee Lovelady. John Tower is from Texas, so is Oswald. And as I mentioned before, Billy Lovelady is the very controversial person who could be one of the Lee Harvey Oswald doubles, standing at the doorway just when Kennedy's car came back in front of the depository, and people thought Oswald was downstairs because this Lovelady was a dead ringer for John Kennedy. Now, Ruth Payne, whose husband worked for Bell Aerospace, got Lee Oswald the job in the book depository, where Mr. Lovelady also worked. If you saw national television this past week, they had a 1-hour movie on Project Paperclip, and they referred to Walter Dornberger, the Nazi criminal who came out to the United States on Project Paperclip for making missiles and rockets and weapons. Dornberger brought Wernher von Braun with him, and he was director for many years of Bell Aerospace, where Ruth Payne's husband worked for Walter Dornberger. So we have a Lovelady, I haven't checked this out, Linda Lee Lovelady, the secretary for John Tower, a Billy Lovelady in the depository, Ruth Payne, the hostess who housed Marina Oswald, who drove her to New Orleans and back, had Lee stay there on the weekends, and her husband worked for Mr. Dornberger at Bell Aerospace. And these people, in 1987, you see movies of Mr. Dornberger, but what they don't show is the relationship of Dornberger to Bell Aerospace or Ruth Payne, or locating Lee Harvey Oswald as a patsy in the Texas School Book Depository. Now, Sylvia Marr, who wrote an index of the Warren Commission and accessories after the fact, has to be a high-level agent of the United States government. And she did an index of the Warren Commission hearings that I've mentioned before and left out many of the important people that came from Munich, Germany, and worked in Dallas, Texas, or in aerospace that were part of the assassination. When I looked up Sylvia Marr's index to see if she had Linda Lovelady, the secretary of John Tower, there, because this is a definitive index of people involved in the assassination, she excluded Linda Lovelady. She had the one at the Texas School Book Depository, but very nicely concealed some of the most important people that are effective in our government today, whose names were in the Warren Commission hearings going back to 1964. One of the men she left out, and I mentioned it many times, is Robert Morris. Robert Morris was the chief counsel for Senator Joe McCarthy. Joe McCarthy went over to Dachau prison and released Fritz Kramer, the prisoner who I believe is now in charge of the Pentagon and the National Security Council for the past it was many years of 1948 when he went directly to the Pentagon, the mentor of Henry Kissinger. Among the 28 people, she left out Robert Morris's name. In 1960, that was before Reagan was governor, when Young Americans for Freedom was formed by William Buckley, who worked with the CIA. Members of the founders of YAF with Buckley were Robert Morris, who was left out of the index, Strom Thurmond, Senator John Tower, and Ronald Reagan. 6 years before Reagan was governor. But there was an affiliation of Ronald Reagan with John Tower going back to those early days when Young Americans for Freedom became a front for the intelligence community and for persons to infiltrate and take over because of General Walker and the teams with Robert Morris to be in Dallas at the time of the Kennedy assassination. Now, Robert Morris in 1987 is working with Reverend Moon. He's on the board of the International Security Council. He works, that's a group with the former head of NATO, heads of the CIA, and also on that board is Joseph Churba, president of the International Security Council. We go from Dallas in 1963 up to 1987. Now, when Ronald Reagan had a transition team, when he was to become president, he had a team of advisors who are now behind these billions of secret dollars for other projects. The advisors formed what they call the National Security Transfer Team for Ronald Reagan. And it included David Abshire, who's now in charge of the White House to screen out and diversify the charges against Ronald Reagan and water them down, one of the co-founders of the Center for Strategic and International Studies with Richard Allen. Richard Pipes is part of this transition team when Reagan came in, and they told him he had to start taking Libya as a piece of redesigning Africa. Eugene Rostow, Michael Ledeen of Contragate Story, and Joseph Churba. Now, Ledeen is the one that set up the meetings with Mr. Gorbanifar and with Robert McFarlane, a protege of Kissinger, who worked directly under Kissinger. Ledeen and McFarlane come out of the Kissinger, Haig, Kramer ilk, and the National Security Transfer Team was set up in the late 80s, but Joseph Churba, the chairman of the International Security Council with Robert Morris, is part of the transitional team of what countries we invade and who we kill, setting up Ronald Reagan for international matters. The private citizen, the average person in this country, has no inkling of how these people connect from 1963 right up to 1987 and make provisions, as they publicly claim now, for World War III or IV. Now, Walter Stessel was ambassador in the Soviet Union at the time. Lee and Marina were writing letters, a letter to John Tower, and then he passed it on, and the embassy got the messages, and their papers were waived, and they came home very quickly. Stessel was ambassador at that time, and when Ronald Reagan was elected president, Walter Stessel was Deputy Secretary of State under Alexander Haig, and part of the transition team. He moved right into office to take care, right out of Moscow, the Lee and Marina milieu, and the persons, Lee and Marina writing to John Tower, Reagan with Tower and YAF going back to 1960s, a long linkage of people, and then Stessel getting an appointment under Alexander Haig with his same transition team. He passed away last year. When Lee and Marina wanted to come back to the United States, the man who has his name on the signature to the embassy in Moscow, the one who was connecting Oswald to the International Rescue Committee and so forth, and giving Marina passage, even if her papers weren't signed, they could get on to Belgium and be home in the best interest of the United States. John Anthony McVicker was the man at the American Embassy in charge of Marina's papers in Moscow, and if you read the book Who's Who in the CIA, it has a description of the stations and locations of John Anthony McVicker. Now, the very persons that Sylvia Meagher left out of her index of the Warren Commission hearings, and I've had this on the air before, are a who's who of connections such as Lev Dobrianski, working with Robert Morris and Colonel Willoughby from the YAF. Dobrianski is part of the World Anti-Communist League, working today with John Singlaub. His daughter, Paula Dobrianski, has been in the National Security Council with Sven Kramer, the son of Sven Kramer, and he was the ambassador to the Bahamas set by Ronald Reagan, a well-known fascist links to Nazi Germany. These kinds of people's names linked directly to Robert Morris, who now works and always did, with the likes of Moon when he came into this country and so forth, were very carefully kept out of indexes. And, of course, the secretary for John Tower, Linda Lee Lovelady, is she related to Billy Lovelady in the Texas School Book Depository Building. Now, I wrote about all these people in 1983, the 20th anniversary of the assassination of John Kennedy, in the Rebel magazine. I wrote about Young Americans for Freedom and Robert Morris, the advisory board of YAF, Strom Thurmond, Tower, Reagan, Lev Dobrianski, and Charles Willoughby, and Robert Morris. Willoughby was in charge of the entire security for Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines. He came out of Hitler's Kriegsacademy, and his name was Karl Wiedenbach. So this linkage of the far right wing isn't something new. The press secretary coming out of the Hitler's Youth isn't new, and the appointment of John Tower to keep the NSC as it is, remove a few people and keep it as it is the framework by which you do coups and assassinations, and it all is legal because the president ordered it. My time is up, and next week we'll continue with a lot more of Contragate. It'll be going on for the next 50 years, but it's interesting. There's so much material. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week. Thank you for the articles and books and material you're sending me, and I hope to get it on the air eventually, if not next week. Thanks a lot, and I'll be back with you to continue along with this material.